Okay, so I guess we'll start by introductions, and then we'll just start chatting away, I guess. Let's see how we go. So my name is Jason Taylor. I'm the digital business manager at Square One, and of the last couple of months and so on, we've seen this massive rise of the interest in diversity and inclusion, and I'm sure my guest Patrick will talk in more detail about this, but everybody's talking about unconscious bias training. Lots of people are already doing it. A lot of people are making it mandatory now. And a lot of our clients are coming to us and asking, how they can improve their reach in terms of, more diverse candidate bases and underrepresented groups. And I started having a look around the market, and one of the companies that fascinated me was Be Applied. So we invited Patrick White. You are head of growth at Be Applied. I'll allow you to introduce yourself, but we decided we'll have a chat about this in a bit more detail. Patrick's an expert in this area, so I'm not going to steal your thunder. Over to you. Do your introduction, sir.
Thank you. So my name is Patrick. As said, I work at Applied. My background has been in talent. Basically, I've worked in exec search, I've run graduate recruitment, that sort of thing. More recently, I helped develop products to remove unconscious for sort of strategy consultancies and that sort of thing. But I've been working at Applied for a couple of years now. And we think and talk a lot about the effects of unconscious bias, what it is, and how you mitigate it. And we build technology in order to help people be less biased in their recruitment processes. And that's kind of what we do, and that's our area of expertise.
All sounds pretty ideal, and many people out there crying out for this. So, one of the first things I wanted to ask you was, since the Black Lives Matter movement, have you seen any kind of increase in interest in what you guys are doing, or has it been business as usual?
Well, I think, there was obviously COVID happened, and believe it or not, recruitment technology might expect, but then Black Lives Matter happened, and they sort of cancelled each other out. So I would say we're basically operating as business as usual. Those two opposing forces sort of counterbalancing each other and how interested people are in what we do. But as hiring gets back to normal, I'm hoping that obviously a lot more people will remain interested in removing bias from their recruitment processes. Fingers crossed, here's hoping.
Yes, absolutely. So for you, I've seen some of your webinars, very, very informative stuff on there. And your approach to bias and unconscious biases is very focused. What would you say? What is your take on unconscious bias in the recruitment process, and why so many people at the moment are focused on unconscious bias?
Yeah, people have been studying the effects of unconscious recently beginning to sort of really hit the mainstream in terms of concern. In terms of the effects of unconscious bias on recruitment, they're super measurable. So you can see them really, really clearly. And the major way that we sort of can see their effect, and they're sort of beyond doubt, is to look at what they call correspondence studies. And correspondence studies are where you basically send thousands of identical CVs to employers, and then you measure the callback rates. So how many of those people get callbacks, inviting them to interview. But on each of these identical CVs, you just change a couple of details. So for example, the name, or in Europe, the picture. So you would sort of change the name to one which is typically associated with a white person, to one which is typically associated with a black person, or maybe someone from the Middle East originally. And what you see from that is clear evidence of unconscious bias. The CVs are identical, so the only difference is the name. But one of the most famous example is one involving what they call the Sandra Bauer and Miriam Ozturk experiment, where basically they did this, same exact CV, Sandra Bauer, Miriam Ozturk, so this is in Germany, classic German name, classic Turkish name, and then Miriam Ozturk with a headscarf, obviously in in Europe, people put their pictures on their CVs. And it was the same women in each one, so it wasn't sort of attractiveness or anything. And what you saw was, when it was Sandra Bauer, got a call back 18% of the time. When it was Miriam Ozturk, it was 14% of the time. And when it was Miriam Ozturk with a headscarf, it was only 4% of the time. So there is no possible explanation for the difference apart from the bias against that person. Now, you could argue about whether that is unconscious bias or actually just people being racist, but that's sort of a broader part of the debate. But these correspondence studies have been done hundreds of times. In the UK, for example, a really famous study called Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal. And it showed that with identical CVs, it took 10 applications per callback for a white name and 15 applications per call for a black name. So we can see the evidence of unconscious bias all over the place in recruitment processes.
There you have it. I'm not surprised to hear about that from working in recruitment for many years. You see various forms of bias, but that's interesting. What I also wanted to ask you was in terms of unconscious bias and it being rolled out everywhere at the moment. I think, what is your view of that? Is that if I run in an organisation and I want to get my staff more engaged in this debate and understanding how to improve it, would you see that as being the first logical step to raise awareness of D&I in an organisation?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I mean, unconscious bias training, or diversity training in general, the US spends pre-COVID, BLM, sorry, the US was spending about $8 billion a year on sort of diversity training. The use of it is really, could it be used as a useful first step? Possibly, but only selectively. So if you're wanting to talk to your sort of senior management about the importance of changing your processes, whatever it happens to be, diversity, putting them through some sort of unconscious bias training so they're aware of the effects of unconscious bias is quite possibly a good use of time. So a small selective group at the sort of management. Unfortunately, sort of more broadly, there is absolutely no evidence that unconscious bias training works at all in terms of changing behavior, addressing explicit bias, or even reducing implicit bias for more than a couple of weeks. So where it could be useful, and the only place it can be useful, is really that initial awareness raising activity.
Okay, interesting. I know many HR departments and teams will be rolling their eyes right now, but the stats I'm sure speak for themselves. So okay, so what works alongside unconscious bias training then? What do we do as an organisation? If someone comes to me at one of our consultancies and says, how do we effectively increase D&I in our business? Well, what's the best way to do it? Because they might have rolled out one of these many unconscious bias packages and training and think we do that biannually. That's our way of doing it. Is there a more effective way of doing this?
Well, there's certainly more effective ways. Maybe it would be useful, as you say, if people are a little bit skeptical, to just dwell on the evidence for a second of sort of why it doesn't work, because that also reveals what you have to do to actually improve D&I and remove unconscious bias. So, I mean, I guess that there's 4 ways in which unconscious bias training could be useful, right? There's the raising awareness. There's that first bit where you're actually just making people aware that this is a thing that exists. The second is the reducing implicit bias. I mean, this is what unconscious bias training is trying to address. At the beginning of any unconscious bias training, what you're doing is you're measuring supposedly people's implicit bias, and that's their preference for one group over another group, and sort of the stereotypes that they associate with that group. The third is addressing explicit bias, so people who actually believe all the stereotypes consciously, not just unconsciously. And the fourth, the actually important bit, is changing behavior. Does this actually change anyone's behavior? Does it change the outcome in any organization? And in terms of raising awareness, there is some evidence that can be useful for raising awareness. So there's a couple of studies, one in 2014 and one in 2017, that showed a sort of slight increase in self-reported awareness of unconscious bias after some training. In 2016, there was an even better study which showed a heightened ability for people to detect the gender diversity of their environment. So at least they actually started noticing that there was no women about. It wasn't just all men. But when you move on to the sort of actually reducing implicit bias, the most positive study ever done by Devine in 2012 with only 91 participants showed a slight drop in implicit bias for up to 8 weeks after the training. But after that, not so much. But much bigger studies, including Lai Skinner in 2016, which had almost 6,500 participants, only showed that it lasted for a few hours. A meta-analysis of 426 studies in 2018 found very weak effects. But then you go on to sort of explicit bias, that's the implicit bias. And if you look at the explicit bias, actually it gets people angry. People often walk away more racist than they walked in. And in fact, there's a sort of strong, compelling evidence that mandatory diversity training, it makes people resentful. It activates stereotypes in their head that they'd actually long forgotten about and reinforces them. People basically, like kids, people don't like being told what to do, and they don't like being told what to think, and it actually has a counterproductive effect. But the most important thing is, does this actually change behavior? And there's been big studies, Rines and Rose in 95, the most influential, looking at businesses that have done unconscious bias training, and if it's actually impacted how many women are in management, how many people of color are in management, how many black people are in management, how quickly they get promoted, hiring rates. And not only is it shown to have zero positive effect, it's actually shown sometimes to have a negative effect. It's called a licensing effect. It makes people feel complacent, like they've done their thing and that's enough. So what I sort of talk sort of quite negatively about unconscious bias training, that's the reasons why. But your question was, what does work if that doesn't work? And that's a really good question. I think the core of it, like the base problem is you can't, unconscious bias, you have to understand what unconscious bias is. We have two ways of thinking, what they call system 1 and system 2. And this was Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winning sort of economist psychologist who sort of discovered all this. Your system 1 thinking is your fast intuitive thinking. It's how you know that someone dressed a certain way will, this sort of is a bus driver. It's how you know 2 + 2 = 4. It's how you can walk home while you're sort of playing on your phone. And it's the way that we make most decisions on a day-to-day basis. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we have to. It's like how we survive and interact with the world. And then there's system 2. And system 2, which is your slow, effortful thinking. It's when you sort of do 526 times 13. It's when you actually plan a trip rather than just walk home unconsciously staring at your phone. And when you look at system 1 and system 2, these are sort of ingrained in how we experience the world and how we think. And these system 1 sort of shortcuts, these mental shortcuts to allow us to navigate the world, to understand that a chair is a chair, that the stereotypes we form about people, all these little mental shortcuts. The idea that you could ever get rid of these with a 2 to 3 hour training session is patently absurd, like it always has been. And no behavioral scientist has ever claimed that making people aware of their prejudices or their biases, most of which have nothing to do with discrimination, anything. It's just like, as I say, it's how you know 2 + 2 = 4. The idea that you could get people to unlearn this in 2 hours or 3 hours, or even a couple of days worth of training has just never been suggested by anyone. So rather than trying to change people, which is very difficult, if it's even possible, it possibly is possible given like an entire lifetime of work. But rather than trying to change people, we want to change the environments around people. We want to make processes such that people's biases are not going to affect their decision-making. So a really simple version of this is, rather than trying to teach people, rather than trying to undo an entire lifetime worth of stereotypes that have been built up around women, people of color, white people, everyone, in 2 hours, which is clearly not going to work. Instead, you just remove the name. You have an anonymized application. And that just like, rather than trying to change a person, you just change the decision-making architecture. And that's kind of at the core of like good diversity technology. It's not trying to sort of change people overnight. I mean, we obviously want people to change and we want to get rid of those stereotypes, But rather than trying to change it overnight, what we're trying to do is mean that their biases cannot influence their decision making in that moment.
Well, that makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, I think in terms of the whole unconscious bias training thing, probably said unconscious bias more than I've ever said it over the last. But it's about for me, it's about the expectation after that training. I can't imagine that, we as a company expect people to walk out of an hour-long session, thinking of the world in a different way. And like you said, that would take years to kind of deprogram those things. But, just to make clear, we do unconscious bias training, but our kind of expectation is just to start the conversation, rather than expect to change people's behaviors. But like you just said, the approach of changing the process is really, I think the most important thing. And for us, understanding who out there is doing this well and how it works is really, where we want help as a business, and as other recruiters. I can imagine that's where they see the focus. And the global diversity recruitment software market at the moment is just growing, as you know, exponentially, year on year. So I guess my next question to you is how do you source candidates from underrepresented groups? How does this, I guess, give an organization access to a more diverse talent pool? Because that's going to be the question on a lot of people's lips. What is it you're doing that's going to make things better then?
Yeah, I think that's really fair. We're not a sourcing tool. We're an assessment tool, basically. So we will remove bias from your decision making in lots of different ways. But broadly speaking, like who finds you in the first place, that's kind of a sourcing problem. But having said that, one does sort of solve the other. So maybe I'll just mention quickly how we sort of approach it and how we think about it, but then also maybe with my sort of ex-recruiter hat on, how sort of thinking about that sourcing problem a bit more. When we've had about 170, 180,000 people come through our platform. And to explain briefly, what our platform does is, rather than looking at people's CVs directly, you get people to do work samples. So you test their skills directly. You don't look at it as a proxy for it. And so, for example, if you're hiring a salesperson, rather than saying, when did you sell this as a question, it's very much, write us an email selling us this, and then you'll be judged on the basis of that email. So it's looking very much at what people can do. But what we found is really interesting is that when you test people in this way, when you're sort of not making assumptions about what people can do, with all that sort of unconscious bias you're bringing to it, the amount of diverse talent that appears is extraordinary. So we've had 170 or 180,000 candidates go through our system. We've had about 7,000 people hired through it. And we've seen a 3 to 4 times increase in the number of people of color who have been hired and applying on that basis. And I'm not convinced necessarily that more people of color are applying, although maybe they are. What I am convinced at is they're being better discovered. Because rather than looking for things that you typically associate with someone being a good candidate, which might be more prevalent on the CVs of white people, you're actually testing those skills directly. And lo and behold, it turns out that a lot of people of color have these skills as well. They just needed to be discovered. So you can get a more diverse talent pool just by taking your existing talent pool and making sure that you're evaluating it in a better way, in a non-biased way. So that's sort of, on the one hand, how you can just, even improving your assessment actually helps you discover diverse talent. On the sort of other side, on sort of how you source diverse talent, I like to think of recruitment jobs as products. So if you think of any type of product, like whether it be clothes, music, video games, makeup, whatever, they're all designed as products to appeal to a certain audience. So you will have clothing brands that are aimed at sort of older people, younger people, sort of urban people, people of color, white people, etc. Like commercial brands, they know how to build a product to appeal to a certain audience. But jobs are products as well. There's like lots of things that make up a job. There's like what you do on a day-to-day basis. There's how you talk about it. There's who you'll be hanging out with on a day-to-day basis. There'll be the associations of the brand. There'll be the benefits. There'll be all these things. And most jobs as products are designed to appeal to a very certain audience, which is typically white, typically maybe slightly less male now, but still typically male, university educated, from a certain class, background, etc. They are products that have been built to appeal to these groups. And if you want to understand why no person of color, no woman is applying to your tech role, have a look at that role as a product. Who are they going to be hanging out with on a day-to-day basis? Are they going to feel comfortable there? If you're thinking about women, is there a great maternity package? Can they see other women in that role sort of progressing? Like, all these things make up the product. If you start thinking about your roles as products in that way and thinking, okay, we want more people like this, what do we actually have to do to make this appealing to them? And I don't think people often do that. They go out, they try to find more diverse people by actively headhunting them. Great. Doing outreach, but the product itself was never designed to appeal to them. And that's what you need to sort of look at from the ground up. If this was a product, how would we make it appealing to the groups that we're trying to attract? Just like you would sell anything else.
That is assuming, though, that a lot of the people that are, let's say you're evaluating the job as a product, are aware of their environment.
Yeah.
And I do feel that it seems obvious to the likes of yourself, and I guess more obvious to me the more I think about this. But I think like what we are doing and what you guys are doing is we're raising awareness. These things are not rocket science. A lot of the time, it's just about creating the right kind of environment that appeals to a broader set of individuals. Is crucial in order to build a more diverse pool. And I think people, companies and individuals and talent teams often kind of skip that because they're thinking about speed of response and how, wearing your old recruiter hat, how are we going to get this position filled as soon as possible? So yeah, that's part of the problem, I feel.
And I hasten to add, like, I'm a white guy. I don't know how to build necessarily a product that's going to appeal to young black women. Like, I would be the wrong person to ask. If you want to know, like, what's going to appeal as a product to a particular group of people, ask them. Like, talk to them. Yeah. Like, don't just like sit as a bunch of well-meaning but sort of white middle class people in a room and just like try and come up with it yourself. Like, go and ask people, like, find out what do they want, what would appeal to them. And that is very important to us. Think of it like a product, but don't necessarily think that you're the one to come up with it.
I mean, there are countless numbers of examples of that, of recent and in the past. I mean, the one that kind of the kind of, obviously working in the digital sector, we work with a lot of advertising and design agencies, and it always baffles me when I see an advertising campaign that completely alienates a specific group. And for me, one of the things that resonates for me is the Muller Bears campaign. I don't know if you remember that from a couple of years ago. The 5 Muller Bears, the Muller yogurt.
Oh, yogurt, yeah.
Bears, and they all had these kind of hip hop names and cane runners. It was just so badly done. And that ad campaign was a couple of art directors in a room having a laugh, being completely no intention of being offensive, but like you just said, they just made a massive problem. I don't know who would have signed something like that off. A massive problem. They managed to can the campaign after a lot of people kind of pushing back on it. But like you said, it's just a simple thing. If you involve a more diverse, set of people in terms of creating these things, then you're not likely to have those problems going forward. Someone's going to point it out. So the other thing I was going to ask, obviously, what's going to be of interest to a lot of the guys listening to this podcast, we're a recruitment agency, so there'll be other recruitment agencies listening to this, is how you work with other with recruitment agencies like us or third parties. Do you partner with these guys and kind of offer solutions to joint projects, or are you guys in competition with the likes of us? Are you trying to make traditional recruitment contingency recruitment companies? Is this are we enemies to you? I just wanted to understand, your perspective on that.
No, absolutely not. In fact, I think good recruiters should love it. And we've worked with a number of recruiters, worked with a lot of recruiters who run outsourced graduate schemes, because obviously then they have control of the whole process and it's really useful to them. But I mean, obviously the technology would mostly sit client side.
Yeah.
And this would be a sort of portal we put people through. But for good recruiters, it's actually good. And the reason that is, I remember from when I was a recruiter, like often your biggest battle is you've met a candidate, you know they're good, you know they're really good. You know their CV might be a little bit unconventional, but you know that they could do the job and do it really well. Now, half the battle for a typical recruiter is convincing the client to actually interview this person and just give them a shot. Like that can often be a battle. Imagine if that battle didn't exist. Like if you're actually candidates having their skills tested directly under anonymous, you know that as a recruiter, your candidate will never be discriminated against because they won't know who comes from a recruiter and who is direct. You know that their skills will get tested directly. So if they are good, they will get through. It doesn't matter what their CV looks like. So actually, I think it could reintroduce a lot of the art and craft back into recruitment. Less sort of CV keyword matching, more, is this person actually good? I think in some ways, actually, it will allow recruiters to become less salespeople and more talent experts, more actual talent evaluators. Because, I mean, there's always this tension with agency recruitment is, am I there to find the best person for the job, or am I there to find the person that the client will hire for the job? And there's always been that tension, because sometimes that's not the same thing. And I'm hoping that as more customers use this and as recruiters then start sort of interacting with this kind of platform, a de-biased process, that they will actually get to become more experts again, more talent experts, and maybe slightly less salespeople.
And completely, and I think for recruitment agencies, that is often the kind of battle you're having generally with clients, and also in introducing this argument of increasing talent pools. The focus is often speed of response, and like you just said, is this person going to be the person that my client wants to hire? And having that consultancy approach where you're saying, the client might latch onto a particular candidate, but they might not be the best candidate for the job, but you often just let the client just go with whatever they think or feel about that individual. But the other thing is, we as recruitment agencies, have most large agencies are part of, some sort of best practice organization. This is what separates the cowboys from the industry professionals. So, APSCO is a big organization that supports a lot of recruitment agencies, and they provide great training and support. But I do feel that the likes of APSCO have a kind of responsibility to start engaging with companies like yourself and talk about reinventing the recruitment process in general. Do you, or have you ever come across anyone from an organization like that said, right, I like what you guys are doing, we want to roll something out like this across the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of the things we've incorporated to our platform, they're very consistent with what is considered best practice by all sorts of organizations like this, whether it be the Government Qualities Office, CIPD, or whatever it happens to be. Obviously, in their role as the sort of best practice, they can and should be technologically ambiguous. So not making necessary recommendations, a particular type of tech, but a particular type of way of doing things. And we collaborate all the time on sort of papers and research and stuff to work with them with that. But yeah, I think they've got a huge role. I think I think in some ways they could be more proactive and more vocal, and be willing to say, actually, to take one example, the evidence clearly shows that unstructured interviews are less predictive and more biased than structured interviews. Unstructured interviews are not really an acceptable way to run interviews in the 21st century. I think in some ways they could be slightly more aggressive is the wrong word, but more forthright, and actually be a little bit tougher with businesses that are doing it badly, and rather than sort of saying this is how we recommend to it, it's like, no, hundreds of papers have showed this is the only way to do it. Come on guys, sort it out.
yeah. Not having to go at you, APSCO, but you do have a responsibility. That's all I'm saying. Okay. I won't attack them anymore. That's cool. That's cool. So, have you found that obviously you work with a lot of companies, probably less recruiters out there at the moment. And what's the appetite for changing the recruitment process then with the majority of people you're speaking about? Do you get a lot pushback? I mean, or how are you finding you get clients ultimately? Are they coming to you, or are you selling hard into these guys?
No, I'm largely coming to us. I think most heads of people, heads of talent, heads of HR, they're quite a diligent bunch. They're quite curious. They want to know what best practice is. They want to know what the research says. At least most of them do. I suppose the ones who come find us do anyway. But broadly speaking, in terms of appetite, most of them kind of know this is the right way to do it. Like that argument, at least with the heads of people, the heads of talent and stuff, has been somewhat won. They know that applications should be blind, that CVs are actually rubbish at predicting who's going to be good or not. That, they should structure interviews, that they should be measuring adverse impact. They know all this. I think their biggest challenge is often getting their own organizations on board. So a lot of what we do, so I run the community at Applied, a lot of what we do is to focus on building business cases, building sort of evidence, change management. Like, how do you convince all these line managers that actually this is how they should do recruitment? The recruitment is a bit like education in the sense that because everyone's been through it, they think they're experts on it, much to the chagrin of teachers, but also recruiters. And you get a lot of line managers who think they're great at interviewing, think the way they hire is great. Actually, if you look at the data, they're not very good. Like, they haven't been brilliant at predicting high performance, etc. But letting people, getting businesses to sort of let go of the controlling their sort of recruitment process, like every individual line manager, just how they like it, and actually listening to sort of the evidence, it is, I think, the biggest challenge that we always face, to be honest.
Yeah. And are more organisations buying into the whole idea that diversity and business performance are positively linked? I think for a lot of people that is where the conversation, if you're convincing a CEO to change a practice, that's often the way that the conversation I feel will have to start. Do you feel that more people that you're speaking to are realising that there's a link in between good business performance and having a diverse workforce?
Yeah, I mean, McKinsey put out a study, I think, a couple of years ago, which is the famous one that everyone quotes about diverse businesses are this percent more effective, etc. I get a sense, I get a bit of a sense, and this is my subjective, that in the post George Floyd world, or sort of Black Lives Matter world, a lot of people are starting to find the business case a little bit gross. And I think whereas a year ago everyone was very much focused on making the business case, like this is in your own benefit, etc., I think the conversation has shifted to this is the right thing to do. If your processes are discriminating against women, against people of color, this is just unacceptable. And I think the conversation has become more robust. Now, the business case can certainly be made, and sometimes you do have to make a bit of a business case. You have to meet people where they are, not where you would like them to be in terms of convincing people and getting them on board. But I think a lot of people now are just sort of like, no, this is the right thing to do, and it's just unacceptable to not be sorting this out. So yeah, I think the business case has been accepted and won, and for some people that will still be an important part of them building a case internally. But I think broadly speaking, hopefully, most people are just like, no, it's just not okay, to be honest. It's just not all right.
That's refreshing to hear, that you're finding you're coming across that more and more. It means things are moving on, and I guess the whole movement is actually impacting employment and talent teams throughout the UK and so on. So that's great. All right. Well, is there anything else you wanted to add to this discussion?
No, I don't think so. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I'd be interested actually from a perspective like recruiters, like agency recruiters. You're somewhat at the mercy of what your client wants and when they want it. How are you finding, like, I guess the diversity battle as an agency recruiter? Are clients willing to wait a little bit longer for a diverse list, or do they just want it yesterday? Like, how do you interact with them as a business if you as a business care about it?
Yeah. I think, like you said, it is difficult because if you feel passionately about it and want to impact change, you have to kind of really, you know, be cautious about having the conversation and choose your audience well. Some people, it's not on their radar. They come to an agency because they are going to pay for a service, and they define what that service is. So they're like, I need CVs for this role tomorrow, bam. Whereas you have people who want to engage with you and respect that kind of relationship, and see you as a consultant. And those are the kind of businesses that we want to work with more and more. And luckily enough, being around for 25 years, as a brand, Square One has a lot of companies that we engage with in that manner. So, we're working on a variety of projects at the moment with some large consultancies that they themselves are advocates of D&I. So therefore, it's quite easy to say, right, this is how we propose to change the process for you guys, so that we are in line with best practice for talent sourcing in this area, which is obviously based around removing names, and so that we can remove that bias immediately from the process and so on. So, but it is obviously not as much as we would like as a business. There are business companies that will define exactly what they want, but what we're finding is more and more companies that we're working with are open to that discussion about changing the process. And I mean, literally in the past 3 months, even in the lockdown period, I've seen a massive shift to people being more open about changing the way they do things. So yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting what you said, it's not on their radar. I mean, presumably now it can't possibly not be on their radar. Really.
I have to be careful what I say here, but yeah, people are kind of locked into, they're in panic mode. Yeah. A lot of companies at the moment, they're just business as usual. We need to get this work out the door. I need people. And that's why I don't think it's not on the radar because they're just completely insensitive. I just think because of the current sensitivity of just being in a pandemic, people are just not necessarily thinking as deeply about things as they can or have done in the past. It's about, damage and limitation and just making sure they can balance the books and get things rolling the way they used to. Yeah.
No, that's a fair point. I think one of the best quotes I heard when I was thinking about these priorities, a guy called Stephen Frost, who runs a diversity and inclusion consultancy called Frost Included. But he said, rather than trying to make diversity and inclusion one of your priorities, is you work out what your top 5 priorities are, and then you sort of say, how can we make these priorities diverse and inclusive? So rather than, because if it's a separate sort of thing in and of itself, it will often just get knocked down, particularly in a current time like this, COVID. But instead, like, my priority is to close, 5 customers. How can I make that as diverse as inclusive as possible, or whatever it happens to be?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting and nice approach. I will actually look at that myself going forward. All right. Well, Patrick, thank you very much for your expertise today. I've learnt a lot just by speaking to you. I always do. Very well versed and eloquently put. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that will have listened to that and it would have influenced them as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me.
No worries now.